Welcome to Case Digest. Today, we're diving into Patterson versus New York, a case that examines the balance between a defendant's rights and the prosecution's burden of proof in criminal trials. In 1985, the case began when William Patterson, who was separated from his wife, borrowed a rifle from an acquaintance. He went to his father-in-law's house and discovered his wife with a former partner. In a highly emotional moment, Patterson shot and murdered the other person involved. Patterson was charged with second-degree murder under New York state law. But during the trial, Patterson raised a constitutional challenge. Did New York's law violate his rights? Patterson's defense argued that New York's law, which required him to prove extreme emotional disturbance, or EED, violated his constitutional rights. The case was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court after being reviewed by the New York Court of Appeals. The central issue? Does requiring a defendant to prove EED to reduce a murder charge violate the precedent set in Winship, which requires the prosecution to prove all elements of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt? To answer this, the court examined previous cases. In Winship, the court ruled that the prosecution must prove every element of a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. And in Mullaney versus Wilbur, it was established that if a defendant raises a defense like heat of passion, the prosecution must disprove it. However, the Supreme Court made a crucial distinction in Patterson. They ruled that New York's law does not violate the Constitution because it treats the crime of second-degree murder separately from the defense of EED. The prosecution still has to prove all elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. The court explained that EED is a mitigating factor, not an element of the crime itself. As such, the defendant must prove it as a defense, but the prosecution is still required to prove the crime beyond a reasonable doubt. The court also differentiated Patterson from Mullaney. In Mullaney, heat of passion was considered part of the crime, while in Patterson, EED is a factor that could reduce the severity of the charge. This distinction was key in the court's reasoning. So, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld New York's law, confirming that requiring the defendant to prove mitigating factors like EED is constitutionally sound. The court reaffirmed that states have the authority to define crimes and defenses as long as it doesn't infringe on fundamental rights. This case emphasizes the balance between the prosecution's burden of proof and the defendant's responsibility to raise affirmative defenses. It's a significant ruling in the landscape of criminal law and constitutional rights. Thanks for watching Case Digest, and we'll see you next time.